Ice's a strange grave in the empty cemetery and the disappearance that shook Mayfield. In the heart of rural Arizona, the little town of Mayfield lay sprawled across the desert plain like a quilt of faded memories and sun-bleached dreams. For decades, it had slept undisturbed beside Route 86, its days swaddled in the routine hush of church bells, the putter of pickup trucks, the neighborly wave from porches shaded by scrub oak and old barn tin. Lou's Diner served blue plate specials to the same dozen faces. Townsfolk knew each other's business as well as their own, or so they thought. That illusion shattered on a searing Thursday afternoon at the tail end of May, when a discovery at the edge of town would trigger a nightmare stretching far beyond the city limits. It started, as so many stories do in Mayfield, with a boy biking home from school. 13-year-old Ben Miller, all ragged jeans and sunburnt bangs, was drifting along Mayfield Road, eyes half watching the horizon, mind already on the cold lemonade, waiting at home. To Ben, the back roads of Mayfield were as familiar as the freckles on his arms, a meandering ribbon of hard-packed dirt, crowned by prairie grass, pinchweed, and wildflowers. Beyond the barbed wire lay dormant fields, and just beyond that, the overgrown perimeter of Old Ridge Cemetery. The cemetery was a ghost of its former self. No one visited now, except a few elderly relatives on Memorial Day. Most of the gravestones had splintered, names and dates faded to whispers by sun and storm. The town council had fenced it off from the rest of Mayfield a decade ago. Rumors, of course, children's dares, whispered tales of old men who'd gone up there to drink whiskey and recall the dead, but never anything truly sinister. Ben, however, was no stranger. Today, seeking a shortcut and a little mischief, he tossed his bike beneath a spindly mesquite and climbed the crooked fence. The grass was so tall it tickled his knees, and patches of sand gnats rose up in clouds as he walked. As he passed a line of cedars, something out of place caught his eye. A rectangle of upturned earth, just a few feet across, set awkwardly near the fence line. The dirt was raw and loose, bright against the usual gray dust, and unlike the settled graves with graveled stones and faded plastic flowers, this mound was fresh as if someone had hastily packed it with a boot. At first, Ben thought little of it. Mayfield had its share of stray dogs and coyotes. Maybe someone had lost a pet. But an uneasy pit wriggled in his gut. He looked closer, nudged the edge of the mound with his shoe, then scrabbled back at the sharp, cloying smell that rose up. Something sweet and putrid all at once. His heart hammered in his ears. Ben didn't stick around. He sprinted home, breathless and shaking, to the clapboard house on Cypress Avenue, where his father, John Miller, tinkered with car engines in the garage. "Dad," he gasped, "I found something bad out by the cemetery." John's brow pinched in a frown. He knew his son. Ben wasn't given to flights of fancy, not since his mother had passed. Within an hour, Ben led his father and the local sheriff, Hank Dalton, to the spot. The adults exchanged uneasy glances at the raw dirt, and Hank knelt to look. The smell, unmistakable now, told a story the eyes didn't want to hear. Hank's radio crackled. "Gwen, I need you out at the Old Ridge Cemetery. Bring county coroner, too. We might have a problem." The word problem spread like a brush fire through Mayfield. By sunset, blue lights whirled silently along the forgotten road. Sheriff Dalton posted yellow tape around the grave, officers keeping townsfolk at bay. Ben watched from behind a cluster of adults, feet scuffling the dust, feeling a strange pride and dread at having been the one to find it, but want nothing more than to forget he ever saw it. The sheriff's team, shovels and gloves in hand, began the grim work of exhuming what lay beneath. The coroner, Gwen Acker, a woman with steely hair and a reputation for kindness, oversaw every careful movement. She'd seen accidents, suicides, the ravages of time on lonely people. But as they peeled back the thin layer of earth, Gwen whispered, "Sweet Jesus." and even she stepped back. Beneath the dirt was the body of a young woman, naked, arranged in a fetal curl, her arms curled over her chest as if she sought to hide herself from the world. The first thing that struck them was the absence of any attempt at dignity. There was no coffin, not even a blanket. The ground beneath her was moist and stained. Her hair, matted with sand and weeds, fell over half her face. Gwen gently moved it aside, saw purple bruises circling her wrists and ankles, traces of rope or wire. Her skin bore cigarette burns and scratches, some fresh, some older. There were wounds on her inner thighs. Despite the horror, she was still someone's daughter, the face eerily familiar. Sarah Lee, who lived 3 streets down from the Millers and had not been seen in 2 days. By the time the sun burned out over the horizon, all of Mayfield was talking, the Lee house alight with weeping and the shock of neighbors who vowed, "This sort of thing doesn't happen here." Except suddenly, it had. The next days became a blur of sirens, search parties, suspicion. What had happened to Sarah? Why had she been taken, tortured, abandoned under a shallow grave, as if the earth itself sought to keep the secret? And, just as troubling, why had Emily Miller gone missing the same night? Her mother's voice, breaking each morning into the silence of her vacant room, haunted those who stood vigil outside their homes. No one had seen Emily since Tuesday, when she left the fabric shop at dusk with a text to her father. "Staying at Jen's tonight. Love you." Gossip spun out from the diner tables, fingers pointed at drifters and loners, exes, and even friends. But the Arjak reality, hard as sun-baked clay, was that no one knew anything. Ben Miller shuddered every time he closed his eyes. His find had unearthed more than a body. It had focused the gaze of the entire region out into the darkness, daring them to discover what else might be buried underneath the surface of Mayfield. As the cemetery became a crime scene, Sheriff Dalton and his deputies shuffled through old-town grudges and half-remembered stories of folks just a little off. The sense of safety in Mayfield disintegrated as parents locked doors that had stood open for decades, as women walked in pairs for the first time anyone could remember. Because now they all knew, monsters didn't only haunt ghost stories. Sometimes they lived just next door. Threads of clues, the mysterious phone trail, and family fears. The air in Mayfield seemed thinner, less comforting in the days after Sarah Lee's body was unearthed. Outside, lawn sprinklers still whirred and distant dogs still barked, but a hush hung over the streets. No one wanted to let their kids walk to the corner store alone, not after what had been found in Old Ridge Cemetery. Everyone was wondering, who would do this? Who among them harbored such darkness? In the Miller household, the tension grew heavier by the hour. Emily was still missing. Unlike Sarah, there wasn't even a trace, just an unanswered text, a promise to stay at her friend Jen's. Then silence. Emily, only 20, was the anchor of her small family, a community college student, still living at home after her mother's passing, holding together the pieces of her father John's heart. John Miller spent that Saturday morning in a fog. Questions ricocheted inside his skull. Why hadn't she returned his calls? Had he missed some subtle sign she was in trouble? Was he supposed to have been a different kind of father? Told her not to go out at night, not to trust too easily? Now, coffee grown cold in his mug, he flipped distractedly through Emily's things, searching for some message, some omitted clue she'd left behind. He found nothing. Just the ordinary detritus of a young woman's life. Textbooks, receipts, a bottle of lavender lotion untouched for weeks. The emptiness pressed down on him until Ben, his son, burst through the door, brandishing a battered smartphone. "Found it by the cemetery," Ben said. "I think it's Sarah's." John peered at the scratched phone, dust-covered, fingerprint smeared. He pressed the power button, desperate, as if it might miraculously ring out with Emily's voice. The screen remained dead, stubbornly black. John fumbled around for a charger, then plugged it in, breath held as a battered battery icon flickered to life. To his surprise, the phone wasn't passcode locked. The home screen bloomed, a picture of Sarah Lee beaming out at him. Same smile as in church last Sunday, only now forever frozen in time. John, with trembling hands, tapped through her call log. There, among casual calls and spam numbers, was something odd. An unknown number with a New Mexico area code. 11 missed calls between 10 p.m. and midnight the night she disappeared. And crucially, a single outgoing text from Sarah to Emily about an hour before. "Hey, got your message. Call you when I get home." He scrolled further. Moments later, another message sent to a different number. "Will you be there soon?" John's stomach twisted. Had Sarah been waiting for someone out there, alone, the night she died? Had Emily? Sheriff Dalton sat at the Miller's kitchen table within the hour, the air thick with the scent of strong coffee and the sharp tang of fear. His notepad filled as John explained what they'd found on the phone, Ben occasionally chiming in with observations about the device's location in the grass. "I'm going to need Emily's phone records," Dalton said, gently but firmly. "Did she ever mention anyone? Any new friends, especially a man?" John shook his head. "She had friends. Lots of friends," he said. "But nothing serious since college started." His voice trailed off. In truth, Emily had always been private. She shared her playlists, her advice, her laughter, but not her late-night heartbreaks. Dalton's deputy made calls of his own to the Lee family, piecing together Sarah's last week. She'd complained of someone following her after her shift at the diner. "Just some creeper, Mom," she had brushed off, though her mother remembered the worry lines etched deeper than usual on her daughter's forehead. By noon, news started spreading. Kids at the local high school whispered about a white pickup seen parked near the cemetery at odd hours. A neighbor's security camera, grainy and green-lit, captured headlight flares down the lane around midnight the night Sarah vanished. John watched these emerging details with growing dread, helpless to intervene. That afternoon, the small-town grapevine throbbed with theories and warnings. At the Miller house, the phone rang again and again. Concerned neighbors, fellow parents, even strangers from a county away. Everyone offered comfort. No one offered answers. Meanwhile, Dalton reached out to the phone company. Within hours, a tech from Phoenix called back with information. The unknown number making those missed calls was registered to a Charles Davis, a handyman who lived alone near the edge of town. A loner, regarded as a bit weird, but harmless, Charles had, until now, never appeared in a single police report. John Miller's heart pounded with each name exchanged over the kitchen table. "Charles?" he echoed the sheriff. "He used to fix fences at our place. Always polite. Quiet." But a memory surfaced. Emily, last winter, mentioning how Charles had started hanging around campus, asking about extra chores, offering to drive her home. She'd laughed it off, saying, "He's trying too hard to be friendly. Dad. But he's harmless, just lonely." The sheriff scribbled this down. "We'll ask him some questions. In the meantime, if you think of anything at all, call me directly, day or night." As dusk crept over Mayfield, the Millers gathered in their living room, not touching the dinner John tried to serve. Ben stared at his plate. John spent the hours scrolling through Emily's old Facebook messages, emails, searching for any sign of secret distress or coded warning. Pictures of Emily and Sarah grinned from the desktop. Pool parties, football games, birthday cakes. Each image felt like a stinging accusation. They'd let their girls wander into danger. The next day, the sheriff's deputies fanned out, knocking on doors along the edge of town, including Charles Davis's property. The home stood silent, no sign of its occupant or his battered truck. An unease settled like dust. Deputies filed a warrant for phone records and began to pull bank statements, surveillance from nearby gas stations, and interviewed anyone who might have seen him or the two girls that week. In every house, the mood was the same, fear barely masked by anger. Lights stayed on late for the first time in years. Mothers double-checked door locks. Fathers sat up clutching shotguns and memories of the daughters they couldn't protect. The grocery store sold out of deadbolts and pepper spray. Yet through the worry and the whispering, a fragile thread of hope persisted in the Miller home. Emily might still come home, might walk through the porch door, as if this was all a misunderstanding, a mix-up. Her absence was still an ache, not yet a scar. The second night after the body was found, John sat at Emily's desk, hands steepled on his lips, listening to the half-mocking buzz of his own anxiety. In the cocoon of his grief, he replayed her last message in his head. "Love you." He wondered what secrets she'd kept, what horrors she might still be facing, and how, in the darkest corners of their gentle town, evil could thrive undetected. Outside, Mayfield was wider awake than ever, and somewhere in the dark, the truth waited to be uncovered. One call, one message, one clue at a time. The horrifying truth. Beneath the makeshift grave and the investigation's grim beginning the next morning, rays of hot Arizona sun cut across the Old Ridge Cemetery, turning the dew on the grass to vapor and outlining the yellow police tape with sharp shadows. The mood, however, was cold and heavy. Folks from town gathered at a distance behind the barricade. Word of the body, Sarah Lee's body, had moved through Mayfield faster than the wind. The grave was still fresh in everyone's memory, but now they needed the facts. They needed answers, however terrible. Sheriff Hank Dalton arrived early. He was a local fixture, a steady presence over 30 years, but even he found himself unsettled as he walked the perimeter. He'd seen death before. Old men, who'd gone quietly in the night, an occasional farm accident, but nothing like this. With each step, he replayed the images from the previous night. Sarah's lifeless form curled within a shallow, hastily dug plot, the bruising unmistakable, violence obvious. The county coroner, Gwen Acker, pulled up as the town clock tower beat 8. Efficient as ever, she set up her workstation, coolers for samples, digital camera, notepad. Her face revealed little, but her manner was brisk. Mayfield's only homicide case in 20 years was one thing. This kind of brutality was another. "Let's get started," she said, pulling on powder blue gloves. The assistant deputy, a young officer named Ray Martinez, handed her the paperwork as small clusters of onlookers murmured prayers and rumors beyond the tape. Step by step, Gwen documented everything. Sarah's body still lay as they'd found it, naked, skin grayed by loss of oxygen, arms folded defensively over her chest. There were no clothes, no jewelry, nothing but dirt, hair tangled with grass, and a thin line of ants marching across her thigh. Gwen began with external examination. "Ligature marks on both wrists and ankles," she narrated, as Ray typed everything on his tablet. "Asphyxiation marks here. See the bruising on the neck." Cigarette burns pockmarked Sarah's torso and inner thighs. Her knees and elbows were scraped raw, as if she'd been dragged or fought desperately on rough ground. The stench of decomposition was thick, but Gwen worked through it, cataloging signs of recent trauma. There were scratches, defensive wounds on Sarah's forearms, and clumps of someone else's hair clutched in her fingers. Her skin bore scratches, blunt force bruises, and what looked like rope burn on her left side. While Gwen worked, Sheriff Dalton surveyed the shallow grave. "No attempt to hide her. Just wanted her out of sight," he muttered. This was desperation, not calculation. "Forensics found tire tracks about 30 feet that way," Ray added, pointing to where the grass had been mashed down. "A set of boot prints, too, but the ground's too dry for a clean cast." Gwen gently extracted scrapings from beneath Sarah's nails. For DNA, she explained. Then a few loose fibers from her leg. Dalton watched her work, mind churning. Who would do this to Sarah? And why? Was it a predator passing through? A local someone knew but never understood? By noon, the county medical van had taken Sarah's remains to Phoenix for autopsy. Gwen had all she could collect: swabs, fingernail scrapings, photographs, full documentation. Dalton found himself addressing the gathered townsfolk, their faces a mixture of horror and expectation. "Until the state lab finishes processing, there's nothing I can officially share," he said, voice gravelly. "But I promise you, we're working this with everything we've got. No stone unturned. We want answers, too." Back at the sheriff's office, the task force set up in the cramped meeting room. Dalton, Ray, 2 state troopers, and Gwen assembled the mounting evidence. Photos of the gravesite, the phone records linking Charles Davis to the evening in question, notes about Emily's disappearance, and a running board mapping witness statements. One deputy relayed the key points from interviews. Sarah left work at 8:10 p.m., texted her mom at 8:45 she was headed home. Last seen near Old Ridge Road by Mrs. Paxton, said she was walking, looking nervous. No confirmation she ever got to Jen's house, or made it home. Another deputy, tasked with sifting through hours of video, interrupted. "Sheriff, I've got something." On a grainy security tape from a bait shop up the highway, a white pickup truck, matching the description from the neighborhood, turned onto Old Ridge Road at 9:18 p.m. Can't see the plates, but time matches. No other vehicles came through for 40 minutes, according to the town's traffic cam. Dalton pinched his brow. Find that truck. Every registration for a white pickup in Mayfield. Cross-check with anyone Sarah or Emily ever knew. One thread tugged at him. The similarities in Sarah and Emily's routines, their social circle, even minor overlaps in workplaces. Was this someone targeting them, or just cruel coincidence? That afternoon, the coroner's report landed on Dalton's desk. Time of death, Gwen summarized over the phone. Sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, Tuesday night. Cause blunt force trauma plus asphyxiation. Sexual assault confirmed. Defensive wounds present. DNA collected, but it'll take a week at least. Dalton stared at the wall, fury rising beneath his calm. His own daughter was Sarah's age, off at college. He felt the weight of every father in Mayfield burning through him. There was evil here now, and it was local. He could feel it. He called a meeting with the task force, laying out what they had: a white pickup, a killer known, at least as Charles Davis in the call logs, but whose face they had only in memory and suspicion. 2 girls, one murdered, one still missing. The town on edge, every parent hovering over daughters, locking every door in town. "Here's how we do this," Dalton concluded. "We call everyone who's ever crossed paths with these girls. We cross off every white truck owner from here to Tucson. We run DNA, fingerprints, shoe prints, anything. We move fast, and we do not let anyone talk us into pretty lies about Mayfield staying safe." Night fell with a thud over Mayfield, bruising the sky with red and purple. In living rooms across town, people prayed and speculated, comforted their children, watched for any sign the nightmare was ending. In the office, Dalton reviewed every photo from the scene again, zooming in on boot prints, false starts in the grass, a single loop of red yarn. Details, all details, the start of what was needed to uncover the truth. Outside, the desert wind howled. Somewhere out of sight, a monster still walked among them, but now, at least, he knew they were coming for him. The hellish shed, where evil took root. The summer sun was already high, pouring through dusty blinds in the sheriff's office when the call came. One of Deputy Martinez's search teams, canvassing the remote edge of Mayfield by the old railroad line, had found something. A battered blue motorcycle behind an abandoned farmhouse, half concealed by warped wooden planks and scrub brush. Sheriff Dalton felt a jolt. Emily Miller's vehicle, or one exactly like it, missing since the night she disappeared. The property was well known to locals. The Davis place. Not much more than a decaying one-story with fields choked by camel thorn and neglect. The house sat askew, as if the earth wanted to spit it out. For years, it had been the domain of Charles Davis, a once friendly handyman whose personality had soured into reclusion after his wife left. Stories swirled, strange noises at night, junkyard dogs, a porch light never turned off. Nobody had cared to check in for at least a year. Now, deputies closed in. The shed at the far end of the property drew their attention first. Compared to the listing house, the shed looked maintained. Locks new, the paint cleaner, a single blackout curtain covering a grimy window. The search team called Dalton, who arrived a tense 15 minutes later, heart pounding with the hope and dread only a cop can know. Guns drawn, officers surrounded the perimeter. "Charles Davis, Sheriff's Office, come out with your hands up." Silence. Only the wind and the distant barking of a dog responded. "Break it," Dalton ordered, and with a hard crack of the crowbar, the padlock snapped. A stale, sour stench rushed forth as the door swung inward, a blend of sweat, rot, ammonia, and sickly sweet perfume. Flashlights swept the room, catching on heaps of clothing, overturned furniture, piles of rotting blankets. And then, a barely audible whimper. In the far corner, huddled on a stained mattress, lay Emily Miller. Her wrists and ankles were lashed with duct tape, her mouth covered by a dirty rag. Bruises spotted her arms, and her hair was caked with dirt. The sense of violation layered upon violation, permeated the filthy air. When a deputy tore away the gag, Emily gasped, lips cracked and skin clammy, her words a slurred prayer. "Help me, please." Dalton and his deputies descended into controlled action. One called for medics, another ripped through the ropes, a third draped a jacket around Emily's trembling frame. Her gaze fluttered through the room, as if afraid the nightmare would begin running again, her voice so raw it barely emerged. Charles. He's not here," she whispered. As the paramedics hustled her to the ambulance, the team's attention returned to the madness within those four walls. The shed was less a structure, more the stage for a monstrous obsession. Clothing was everywhere. Women's blouses, underwear, bras, most alien to the officers, and certainly not Emily's. The musty stink was mixed with a sweeter chemical odor, perfume, deodorant, and rotting food. Pinned to one oil-stained wall were dozens of magazine cutouts. Women's faces, bodies, eyes gouged, mouths scribbled with red marker, some adorned with names handwritten in crude block letters, including, chillingly, Sarah and Emily. A battered hand-built cabinet hung open, revealing a horrific inventory. Ropes, blindfolds, handcuffs, bottles of cheap whiskey, trash bags full of more clothes, several knives, and a bent baseball bat flecked with what looked like dried blood. On the floor, a cluster of worn, stuffed animals, mementos or trophies, no one could say. Under the mattress, officers found 3 cell phones and a flipbook of Polaroids, blurry, frantic shots of women, most unconscious or cowering, their faces obscured. Dalton's rage bristled as he thumbed through. "God almighty," he spat. "He's been planning this for years." In the corner was Charles Davis's recliner, threadbare, stained, cradling a half-empty bottle and a tattered Bible. On a small side table, more duct tape, a rusted pair of handcuffs, and a notepad filled with rambling passages. "They always scream. It's music. Obey. Sarah was weak. Emily is beautiful." Ray Martinez stepped outside, struggling to hold down his breakfast, while Dalton's older deputy, Janice, walked carefully from pile to pile, gathering what evidence she could. Technicians in hazmat gear soon arrived, documenting the space inch by inch. They snapped photos of nearly everything: the grime-caked floor, the keyed locks on the inside of both doors, the blackout curtain nailed into the window frame. A grating, high-pitched beep came from a locked mini-fridge. Inside were bottled water, protein bars, unmarked prescription pills, provisions for a long captivity. The team also recovered 2 wallets with IDs of missing women from nearby counties. It was more than the sheriff had ever seen, more than anyone in Mayfield had ever dreamed could be hidden in plain sight. Outside, townsfolk began to gather as word seeped from ambulance radios and police chatter. Mrs. Abernathy from 3 farms down wept openly. Dear God, all those times I waved to him on his porch. Other locals gaped at the hive of uniforms, a few clutching their own children, suddenly prey to an awful awareness. Evil had not just visited. It had moved in, painted the walls, planned for nights like these. For years, Charles Davis had been odd but harmless to the people of Mayfield, a man whose pain bled out in rumors, not in violence. Until now. Emily, wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket, was wheeled out on a stretcher, eyes glazed but breathing. Deputies saluted as the ambulance sped away, siren, wailing not with warning, but with mourning. A search for Davis ignited. His pickup was gone, tire tracks skidding off toward the dry riverbed behind his property. Dalton stood at the edge, squinting into the noon sun, his mind seething with fear and fury. He planned to disappear, Ray said. He's on the run. Dalton shook his head. He's sick. He'll need supplies. He'll be back. We lock everything down. No one sleeps alone tonight. Back inside the shed, as the evidence techs zipped up another bag, Deputy Janice discovered the most chilling clue of all, a recording device wedged under a stack of old newspapers. She hit play and nearly dropped the recorder at the shrill first words, Charles's own voice, boasting, jeering, talking as though confessing to an audience only he could see. They said I was weird. They were right, the voice rasped. But this is my house, my rules. The angels all scream the same in the dark. The sun scorched the shed's peeling paint as silence redescended, heavy as the earth over Sarah's grave. But now, at least, Mayfield knew what they faced. Not a ghost story, not a shadow, but a man, a neighbor, who had spent years building a fortress for his evil just beneath the surface. And the town braced itself for a desperate hunt, one that would have to end before he killed again. Haunted testimony, unspeakable nightmares in rural America. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and hope, thin, desperate hope, the kind that lingers after tragedy, but before resolution. Bleached sunlight filtered through cheap blinds, casting bars of light across Emily Miller's face as she lay motionless on the narrow bed. Her father, John, sat beside her, silent, one work-worn hand wrapped around hers, clutching as though she might slip away again. The lines on his face had deepened, his eyes, always blue and kindly, now burned with a haunted red. Outside the glass door, deputies loitered, guarding against the unthinkable, that Charles Davis might try to finish what he started. Doctors had already tended to Emily's injuries, bruises on her neck and ribs, dehydration, several shallow cuts on her arms and legs, but her eyes betrayed a deeper injury, one that ached far from the reach of scalpels and stitches. For hours she barely spoke, intermittently slipping into uneasy sleep. Nightmares made her whimper and jerk. She flinched every time a nurse entered her room. It wasn't until late afternoon that Sheriff Dalton, armed with necessity and compassion, gently approached Emily to ask if she could remember what had happened. He brought Deputy Martinez and a counselor from the county's trauma team, someone to take notes and, more importantly, to listen if Emily's voice faltered. John squeezed his daughter's hand. "You don't have to do this, Emmy. Not if—" But she shook her head, jaw clenching. He took Sarah, Emily whispered, and her voice was raspy, each word scraped raw by memory. He said, "I was next." Sheriff Dalton leaned in carefully, his body language gentle. "Start wherever you can. We don't have to rush." Emily's story came in broken parcels, as if she were pulling memories out of deep, cold water. Details emerged fitfully, flashes of headlights on gravel, Charles's voice pleading for help by the roadside, a chill of warning she ignored. He fell, or acted hurt, wanted me to stop. Next thing I knew, he had a knife, took my phone, told me if I screamed, he'd kill me right there. She described the drive to his property, how he ordered her to crouch on the floor of the truck, hands zip-tied behind her, the sickening smell of whiskey and engine oil thick in the cab. Charles said almost nothing as he led her into the shed, just muttered curses, his face closed and unreadable. Emily paused, closing her eyes as though bracing for a jolt of pain. He locked the door behind me. I heard another voice crying. Sarah was already there. She was so scared. The officers were silent. Even the counselor bit her lip. No one was ready for the raw terror of Emily's recollections, the matter-of-fact way she delineated hell. "He kept us tied up," she continued. "Fed us, sometimes. Gave us water when he felt like it. He'd laugh. Would just stand there watching, drinking from that old blue bottle. He liked our fear. He said that exactly. This is what I come home for. The music of screaming. When Sarah asked him to let us go, he hit her, hard." Emily broke, her composure unraveling, tears running down her drawn cheeks. The counselor paused the interview, soothing in soft tones, until Emily signaled she could continue. The worst part, she confessed, was not the pain, but the helplessness, the sense of time dissolving, of being lost in a cave outside the world, waiting for rescue or death. Her own sense of self, stripped away, left a shell. Charles abused them physically and psychologically, switching moods without warning, sometimes cradling their bruised bodies, sometimes berating them with words Emily still couldn't repeat. The moment everything changed came in the middle of the second night. Emily awoke to screams, Sarah's screams, piercing and high and choked. Charles had dragged her, beat her, and when she tried to fight back, he strangled her. Slowly, deliberately, his face inches from hers, daring Emily to intervene. There was blood, so much blood on the floor, and then Sarah stopped moving. Charles just stared, unmoved, like he was watching a movie on TV. Then, with a grunt, he bundled Sarah's broken body in a sheet and vanished for hours. When he returned, his pants were caked with dirt. "He told me she wasn't screaming anymore," Emily said, her voice empty, "and that if I fought or tried to run, I'd get worse." After that night, Emily said, she stopped eating. She refused water, even as her thirst grew, overwhelming. Charles, undeterred, kept her alive, force-fed her sips, kept her hands bound, and talked to her as if she were furniture. Sometimes he'd rant about his wife leaving, about the ingratitude of women, about how the world was stacked against good men. Emily realized he wasn't talking to her. Not really. He was ranting to the ghosts in his head. Between hallucinations and fever, Emily's sense of time vanished. She retreated inside herself, repeating her name, her childhood address, her father's phone number, anchors of memory to stave off the loss of self. Rescue came so suddenly that at first she thought it was a trick. The shed door flew open, the room flooded with light and shouting. Then came the hands, gentle this time, that untied her, ambulance voices, her father's sobbing. "That was the worst part of the nightmare," she admitted later. "The hope. I didn't know if it was real." Each time Emily hesitated, the officers reassured her. "You did everything right, Emily," Dalton said, barely masking the tremor in his voice. "If you remember anything else, even little things about Charles's behavior, his plans, any threats, call me." day or night. The days after her testimony moved in slow motion. News spread, drawing crowds to the hospital's perimeter, well-wishers, reporters, neighbors wanting to help, or simply hoping for a glimpse of the miracle survivor. Emily hated every spotlight. The trauma counselor suggested that Mayfield's compassion was a good thing, but to Emily, the stares felt both gentle and suffocating. John Miller, meanwhile, drifted between gratitude and guilt. He bent over her bed each night, murmuring apologies for not keeping her safe, even as Emily congratulated herself just for surviving. The wider town, too, shifted. Safety now felt like an artifact of an old world, gone for good. At her discharge press conference, Emily refused to answer questions about the ordeal. She had given her testimony once. She would not relive it on stage for strangers or camera crews. As she left in her father's arms, she said only one thing for the record, voice trembling but strong. "Check on your neighbors. Pay attention. Not all monsters live in the city." Back in the sheriff's office, Dalton understood the cost of Emily's courage. Her nightmare, spoken aloud, stitched together the chain of horror connecting Mayfield's safety and its darkest secret. The search for Charles Davis intensified, and now, thanks to Emily's brave, harrowing truth, they finally knew the face and the sickness of the evil they were pursuing. Hunting the Devil of Mayfield, a manhunt across the American West. The capture of Emily Miller alive from Charles Davis's hellish shed set off a wildfire of action in Mayfield and far beyond. By noon, Sheriff Dalton's team was working hand-in-glove with state troopers and even federal agents. Nearly every able-bodied deputy in Pima County was assigned some piece of the chase, their radios crackling with updates and speculation. Roadblocks appeared overnight at every county line, east and west. The town's battered peace had evaporated. Now, fear and determination propelled the manhunt forward into the baking desert. Charles Davis wasn't the sort to leave clues behind. No one had seen his battered white pickup since the search had discovered Emily. The deputies fanned out from the Davis property, combing over cattle guards and dried-up riverbeds for tire tracks, hunting for footprints, cigarette butts, or grocery bags left behind. A K-9 unit sniffed at the shed, then caught a whiff of something in the chaparral where the Davis backyard dissolved into wilderness. Bloodhounds joined in, bristling with excitement. The trail led toward an abandoned quarry miles north, a favorite haunt for misfits and drinkers from the next town over. Dalton coordinated with his team from the field. The heat shimmered off his SUV's hood, sweat trickling down his spine as he scanned the sun-baked horizon. Every radio report hinted at panic and near misses, rumors of a white truck by a service station, a frightened hiker reporting gunshots near Tabletop Mountain, but each proved as brittle as desert mirages. Despite the uncertainty, the search pulled Mayfield together in unexpected ways. Townsfolk offered food and ice water to searchers. Volunteers showed up in battered hats, walking the fence lines with flashlights in their fists and worry lines carved deep on their faces. Each time, Dalton caught sight of John Miller, now relentlessly helping the search parties, refusing to rest since his daughter's rescue. He felt both pride and the deep, aching fear that their years of safety might never return. The investigation became an interagency puzzle, the kind that tested patience as much as resourcefulness. Databases of vehicle registrations were scanned for every white pickup owner within a 100-mile radius. Officers knocked on doors from Mayfield to cells, asking after Davis, showing photos, canvassing small-town motels and gas stations. FBI profilers arrived from Phoenix. They pinned maps and crime timelines to the plywood walls in a spare office at the sheriff's station, tracing Davis's habits, hoping to predict his next desperate move. The psychological war was relentless. News helicopters hovered overhead, their drone a daily reminder that Mayfield's terror was now televised. Outside the sheriff's office, reporters hounded Dalton, their microphones like bayonets, shouting for comment. Across local radio, sermons intermingled with warnings: lock your doors, check your barns, and above all, trust no one. Even seasoned ranchers found themselves searching their own sheds at night, double-checking shotgun shells before bedtime. Charles Davis, meanwhile, remained a ghost. He'd grown up in the valleys outside Mayfield, knew the canyons and railroad trestles better than most. Rumors reached Dalton that Charles had slipped across the dry river wash to the abandoned rail depot, but the track went cold in a tumble of dust and rattlesnake grass. Without new signs, the town's mood soured toward despair, then flickered to hope each time a rumor surfaced anew. Day blurred into day under the fierce desert sun. Every hour brought a new lead that fizzled or forced another round of searching. The FBI's behavioral team briefed the group each morning. Davis, they explained, was methodical, but increasingly desperate. The fact that he'd kept Emily alive so long meant he needed control, not just over his victims, but over the narrative swirling around him. Now, wounded pride and panic made him dangerous in entirely unpredictable ways. Helicopters traced circles above draws and washes, their searchlights white-hot in the twilight. Roadblocks grew, not just on hardtop highways, but along meshwork back roads and seasonal jeep trails snaking through prickly pear. Local militiamen manned their own posts, each suspicious of strangers, while the sheriff's office warned against vigilante justice. Some of the town's teens, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, slept with baseball bats beside their beds. At Mayfield's churches, prayers now included the names of Sarah, Emily, and even Charles himself, because in small towns, even monsters had histories and mothers to mourn them. One night, when the tension seemed set to split the air, a rancher from the far north county phoned in. He'd found a camp, half buried in the sand, with spent matches, protein bar wrappers, and a blood-stained T-shirt caught on barbed wire. Deputies swept in, combing tumbleweed from every rock hollow. Not far from the abandoned quarry, they found bicycle tracks and dog prints fanning out toward the Santa Cruz riverbed. It was only a matter of time now. Davis was on foot, the white pickup eventually discovered deep in a mesquite thicket, hot under the cottonwoods and stripped of plates. Inside were empty water bottles, a cheap burner phone, and receipts for gas bought at a truck stop on the New Mexico border, proof he'd made a run for it, then doubled back into familiar territory. Every hour drew the net tighter, every new search party closing ranks. The manhunt took on a fevered rhythm. Searchers methodically cleared derelict cabins and cattle pens. Trail cameras were placed at key junctions, their night vision blinking red in the pitch darkness. The sheriff's own sleep was little more than anxious catnaps in his office, dreams haunted by the image of Sarah's shallow grave and Emily's battered face. Dalton called in tactical teams for the final push. On the third day of the hunt, a tip landed. A ranch hand had spotted movement in an arroyo near Wild Horse Creek at dawn. The sheriff's convoy roared down gravel roads, dust pluming in its wake. Moving on foot with drawn weapons, the deputies swept through brittle grass and toppled rocks, hearts pounding with expectation and dread. They found Charles Davis at the edge of a dry stream, dug in beneath the bramble and too spent to resist. Hollow-eyed, sunburned, his lips cracked and dirt-caked, he was hunched over a rusted canteen. When the deputies encircled him, there was no struggle, just a flat, defeated look as Dalton snapped on the handcuffs. "It's over, Charles," the sheriff said softly. "For you, for the town, for all of us." The news traveled in ripples. Radios in kitchens and trucks came alive with the headline. In Mayfield, church bells rang at noon. Kids stepped back outside, their parents watching, still wary, but relieved. Emily's father wept quietly on his porch. Even the reporters, ever hunting for a tragedy's next chapter, struggled to find words for the release everyone seemed to feel. But the aftermath was quieter, more complicated than anyone expected. In the sheriff's office, Charles Davis sat stone-faced through questioning. He answered in half-mumbled phrases, sometimes ranting about unfairness and loneliness, other times going silent, staring through the glass as if he saw ghosts. The interrogators pieced together a story of obsession, betrayal, and escalating violence, a portrait of evil brewing for years beneath the surface of a forgotten town. By nightfall, Mayfield felt changed. Relief pulsed through the town, like the first hesitant rain after a drought, washing away some, but not all, of the fear. There were still locks on doors, still empty seats at the diner where Sarah and Emily used to sit, and the shadow of trauma lingered everywhere. Yet the unity forged in those blazing days would endure. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now greeted each other with nods and murmurs of solidarity. Sheriff Dalton, exhausted but resolute, walked home under the broad Arizona sky, thinking about the long process of mending ahead. Justice, in its slow and flawed way, was moving forward. But true peace would be harder won. The nightmares, the grief, and the reminders that even in a quiet corner of the American West, evil can crawl from beneath the dust at any time. For now, though, the hunt was over. In Mayfield, that was enough to let the town finally, though gingerly, breathe again. Criminal psychology and the end of the Mayfield nightmare. The cleanup after Charles Davis's arrest was not just physical. It seeped into the hidden parts of every life in Mayfield. The investigation's closing stages put the town into a peculiar, restless limbo. For all the tears and prayers, people struggled to accept that evil had worn the mask of a neighbor, of someone who had fixed broken gates and nodded from behind a truck windshield for years. Criminal psychologists flew in from Phoenix to help unravel the tangled mind behind the crimes. The authorities needed answers almost as much as the townsfolk. Why did Charles do it? Why the elaborate shed, the trophies, the meticulous pattern of predation that wove his victims together? Interviews with him proved chilling. Charles displayed no remorse or empathy. While some suspects wilt under harsh lights, Charles stared through investigators, his words cold, measured, and without guilt. He spoke almost clinically about how he selected victims, how he observed them long before acting, and how the isolation of small-town life gave him cover to carry out his monstrosities. A psychiatrist described him as a textbook predatory narcissist, driven by control, fueled by resentment over perceived betrayals, and a life littered with failures. His journal entries, recovered from the shed and his home, painted a portrait of a man obsessed with dominance and revenge. He lamented about his broken marriage, ranted about women who didn't respect good men, and meticulously catalogued every encounter, every thrill, every night spent in the filthy shadows. The journals provided not only crucial evidence for his prosecution, but also something more insidious, a warning for those who thought they truly knew their neighbors. Davis's trial swiftly drew the attention of the entire region, and reporters from Tucson to Los Angeles filled courtroom benches. His defense was feeble, focused only on technicalities. There was no denial. The mountain of evidence, DNA, diaries, digital forensics, and, most damning, Emily's living testimony, left no room for reasonable doubt. The courtroom was dense with grief and unease. Families of known and possible victims wept silently while John Miller sat gripping Emily's hand, sandwiched between terror and relief. When the verdict, guilty on every count, was read aloud, there was no applause in the gallery, only exhausted silence. The state's harshest penalty followed: death row for Davis, a punishment rarely handed down but demanded by the severity of his crimes. Across Mayfield, the news settled slowly, trickling from radios and church bulletins into kitchens and diners. There was no celebration. Instead, relief mingled with an unshakable awareness that justice could not reach the scars left behind. The Miller family, scarred yet united, focused on healing. Though for Emily, healing meant carrying the weight of remembrance every day. She found herself replaying the last hours in the shed, the words and threats, the simple bittersweet taste of freedom once the locks snapped open. In therapy, Emily admitted to feelings of rage as well as gratitude. She rejected any narrative turning her into a symbol. She just wanted to be a survivor, not a headline. For Mayfield's townspeople, the challenge became vigilance without paranoia. Sheriff Dalton led initiatives to update neighborhood watches and mental health resources, and every parent seemed to hold their children tighter, if only for a while. The schools brought in counselors. Church sermons turned somber and practical. Evil isn't an abstract thing, the preachers said. It cultivates itself in silence, in the corners of places where trust is taken for granted. Criminal profiling experts presented their findings in town halls, explaining the red flags and signals, withdrawal, voyeurism, sudden anger, that might precede predatory acts. More importantly, they urged the community not to let shame or fear prevent them from acting. Prevention, they said, comes from awareness and collective courage, not suspicion or scapegoating. Throughout it all, Sarah Lee's memory weighed on Mayfield. Her face watched from photographs at the diner and the post office, her laughter a ghost in family homes and classrooms. The Lee family, devastated, never blamed the Millers or the authorities. Privately, they planted a garden on the edge of town, a quiet place, wild with sunflowers and desert sage, where townsfolk could remember not just Sarah, but every neighbor lost to darkness, named or unnamed, known or never found. For many, the greatest lesson was less about Charles Davis and more about themselves. They questioned what it meant to live in community, to recognize pain in others before it became violence, to reach out rather than recoil. Parents talked openly with children about danger and boundaries. Women, emboldened rather than cowed, created support groups and ride shares. What had once been a sleepy outpost became, at least for a season, a town marked by both vigilance and the fragile hope that light might return. When the media leaves and the routine returns, the story lingers not in the headlines, but in the changed patterns of ordinary lives. The dads who walk daughters home, the shop owner who locks her door after 8, the widower who joins the new church safety committee because, for the first time, he realizes how easy it is to overlook suffering on his own street. The psychologists who had studied Davis quietly issued a final report to the sheriff's office. Their message: evil is not inevitable, but nor is it rare. Communities must be wary of complacency, always ready to face the worst truths so that they can protect what is best in themselves. There is no true return to innocence, but there is the possibility of moving forward, wounded but wiser, more vigilant and united than before. That is Mayfield's inheritance, both curse and legacy, the echo of a nightmare and the never-ending work of ensuring it does not return.